Hello, BookTube. Some of you may have seen that I've been recently doing a read-along of Brideshead Revisited with Matthew at Mayberry Book Club, and it was his suggestion that we do a read-along, and I think it was even his suggestion that we do that book. And it was fascinating for me. I absolutely loved it. Uh, First of all, for the reason that some of you have emailed me and said that you assume is the reason I wouldn't love a buddy read, which is that I had to crawl through it on broken glass on my knees and hands because I read very fast, and I've read this book many times before. But the buddy read, a buddy read that lasts a whole month, forces me to read far more concentratedly, far more ruminatively. So I did that for the month of April. I read one quarter of Brideshead Revisited and then talked about it. And then I read another, and I tried hard not to go ahead so that I would have that right on my mind. That was one of the ways that it was fascinating. Another way that it was fascinating was that Matthew had never read the book before. And when our read-along of Brideshead Revisited was coming to a close, he suggested the folly of youth that we keep doing read-alongs. And even more folly, he let me pick the next book. So I did. I picked the next book, and I went in a different direction than Brideshead Revisited. I picked Batman: Dark Knight Returns, which was a 4-issue miniseries back in the 1980s by Frank Miller that revolutionized not only the conception of Batman at the time, but comic books, superhero comic books, just in general. Totally revolutionized them. And again, the two fascinations here of reading this thing over again were, one, to concentrate. It came out in 4 issues, so we're reading 1 issue per week. And fascination number 1 was to concentrate on that rather than just blast through the whole thing. Concentrate exclusively on this 1 issue, and fascination number 2 was to read it keeping in mind that I'm reading right along with someone who has never read comic books and who's never read Dark Knight Returns before. So that's what we're doing this weekend. You've already seen his video, I'm assuming. I'll leave a link to it down below. We're looking at book 1 of Dark Knight Returns with this incredibly famous cover that has been parodied and pastiched to a fare thee well. There have been literally hundreds of pastiche covers here of this particular, but this was the original. I remember seeing this at the comic shop in 1986 and wondering what it was. I think I'd heard a little word about it in Amazing Heroes, a trade journal of the day or something, or comics journal, something like that. I didn't really know anything about what it was. I knew only that it was an Elseworld story, which I don't think is even mentioned in these reprints, in any of these. I have those original 4 issues in a long box here somewhere. But it was an Elseworld story, which was a thing that DC Comics did, a separate imprint where they could tell sort of what comic book industry refers to as imaginary tales. And those of you who don't read comic books might think, well, aren't they all imaginary? But what Elseworld stories are, or what if stories, or imaginary stories, are stories that are told outside of continuity. So all the stuff that you've learned about these characters in all of the issues that you've been reading doesn't apply. Anything can happen in these stories without it being part of canon. It's not like if, I don't know, Green Lantern, Hal Jordan dies and the ring goes to, a woman in the south side of Chicago. That can happen in an Elseworld story. You won't see it happening in your Green Lantern monthly issue. The same thing was true of this, and I thought, well, that's interesting, although in a way it is the ultimate Elseworld story anyway, because it's set in the future. So it would be an Elseworld story anyway. The continuity of DC Comics is fairly set, marching along, and then there's a huge 1,000-year gap, and then you get the Legion of Superheroes. But one way or another, I don't think this is marketed or characterized as an Elseworld story anymore, and that is very bad. That is a very bad thing, and we'll be getting to why that is probably in this video, and certainly in every other video, because I like to repeat myself. But one way or another, let's first say what this is. First of all, this is a hardcover of just that first issue. When I made my announcement video, I showed one of my early graphic novel collections of these 4 issues that had been battered all to pieces, and I thought, I don't know that this is going to survive. I might have to buy another copy of this graphic novel. And then I saw on my shelf that I actually have a box set of hardcover, slightly oversized reprints of each individual issue. So perfect, absolutely perfect. What this is, Frank Miller is the writer. He is also the artist, with Klaus Janson doing the inks and Lynn Varley doing the colors. And what this is a story set in Gotham City. Of course, the nice thing about Batman Dark Knight Returns is that it is based on the comic book mythology of a comic book character that literally everybody knows. Everybody knows that Batman prowls Gotham City. Everybody knows Batman and Bruce Wayne and Alfred the Butler and Commissioner Gordon. Those things have come at you from TV series. They've come at you from a dozen movies. So people know that and they don't need, this is not the same thing as if you were to do a Legion of Superheroes study where nobody's ever heard of that before. This takes place in a Gotham City that is benighted. It has fallen into a sinkhole of crime, corruption, and insanity. The violence on the street is epidemic. And one of the main reasons for that is because it's been 10 years since the last confirmed sighting of the Batman, Gotham City's foremost vigilante and crime fighter. He has been missing. When this story opens, he's been missing for 10 years. And we know where he is. Frank Miller does a wonderful job with architecture in this and in all of his graphic novels. So we get a truly creepy, ugly Gotham City that is, as this story opens, baking under a heat wave, an unprecedented heat wave. But the story actually, the very first thing we see is one of these 12-panel pages. Look at how small those are. Just a patchwork of little panels designed to convey very close concentration on fast action. And the action is Bruce Wayne, an older, mustachioed Bruce Wayne who is at the wheel of a sports car in an Indy 500 type event, and he is driving the car too fast. It has caught flame. He is being urged. The car is called the Ferris 6000. This is on page 1 of Dark Knight Returns, Volume 1. The car is called the Ferris 6000. Fans looking at that are immediately thinking, wait a minute. Old-time comic book fans are thinking, wait a minute. Ferris, a roadway, automotives, and then, sure enough, in the intercom in Bruce Wayne's ear, we hear someone saying, Bruce, this is Carol, you're going too fast. That is the very first of innumerable Easter eggs for longtime comic book fans, because Carol Ferris is an old character from Green Lantern comics. One way or another, that tells you that Frank Miller, who knows this stuff inside and out, is going to write this thing fairly embedded in DC mythos, and that this isn't going to be just an Elseworld story where the slate is wiped clean. That's kind of interesting, and we're going to come back to that quite a bit. Bruce Wayne survives. His car crashes, but he survives. But he is changed, and we see him almost immediately later on. We see him, for instance, in a conversation with his old friend Commissioner Gordon, who is set to retire in just a month. There's no cheap crime drama or Raymond Chandler gimmick that Frank Miller doesn't resurrect for this miniseries. Gordon is set to retire, a mandatory retirement, but here he is reminiscing with Bruce Wayne about the good old days. And we learn from this reminiscence two things. One is that Gordon knows that Bruce Wayne is Batman. Somewhere along the line, he knew that. In another great 4-issue miniseries that Frank Miller also wrote, Batman Year One, it's pretty obvious that Gordon knows that right from the beginning. And that would certainly make a lot of sense for Batman comic books over the last 80 years. It would certainly make a lot of sense if this really sharp guy, the police commissioner, actually did figure out that this guy that I talk to all the time is this other guy that I talk to all the time. I like to think that running underneath the standard DC continuity is that Jim Gordon knows that Bruce Wayne is Batman, and maybe acting the fool to help throw, the scent off or whatever, in the same exact way that I myself very much like to believe that all along Lois Lane knows that Clark Kent is Superman. That this really tall, broad-shouldered, blue-black-haired white guy who saves Gotham City and who showed up on the same day as Clark Kent is the same person as this broad-shouldered, really blue-black-hair, handsome white guy who came to work at the Daily Planet. For the world's foremost investigative reporter, I really like to think I used to read those old issues and just think, okay, well, you're making her seem like an absolute idiot. I'm going to assume that this is all tongue in cheek. This is just an elaborate bit worked out between two coworkers, but that she knows that he's Superman. Of course she does. And I remember there was one story. It also was a what if imaginary story. It wasn't, Elseworlds didn't exist then, but it was very much designed to be out of continuity. Where this is years and years ago, 50 years ago, in Action Comics, a character confronts Lois Lane and says, "Well, you better be prepared for this." But Clark Kent is Superman. I just thought I should tell you. And she looks at him and immediately says, "What makes you think I didn't know that?" I like that moment, and I like this moment. I just wish that it were an ongoing idea in the comics. I don't think anybody is served by the chief of police in Gotham City being so dumb. But one way or another, that's one of the things we learn from this encounter. And another thing we learn from this encounter is that Bruce Wayne is drinking actual alcohol. He's not Batman anymore, and that is just one degeneration. He has gone to seed. He's still a massively powerful guy. He's what we would consider to be the prime of life. He's 46 years old when this issue starts, and despite the fact that he is constantly being referred to throughout this issue as old, as decrepit, as somebody who can't do anything. There are triathlons that are run every day by people who are 46 years old, but nevertheless, it has been 10 years since he put on the cape and cowl. And in this conversation with Jim Gordon, Gordon mentions, "Have you talked to Dick lately?" That is another call out to old style comic book fans. Dick is obviously Dick Grayson, Robin, the first Robin the Boy Wonder. And Bruce Wayne says, no, it's been years since they talked. Not since Jason, which is another shout out to old style comic book fans. Jason is Jason Todd, who took on the mantle of Robin, and who obviously, even from these first few pages, we know something horrible happened to him. We don't know what, and we're not given time to figure it out, because the meeting breaks up and Bruce Wayne wanders out onto the streets of Gotham City. And look at this, look at the artwork here. That is the Gotham City that he sees. Look at that. That is just wonderful. It is an absolutely filthy, debased, and lost world. And completely contradictory. We are damned. We are saved. He's at a loss. And notice, it's all monochrome except for him. It's all blurry together except for black and white. Except for the absolutes, the moral absolutes of black and white. And quite by accident. Just by random programming. His steps take him to Crime Alley, to a particular lamppost in Crime Alley, which is where his parents were shot dead in front of him when he was a boy. The classic Batman origin story. His parents are shot dead in front of him by a criminal, and he decides to devote his life to crime, to fighting crime. Becomes an expert in all kinds of things, and wonders how to sort of synergize that expertise when a bat flies through the window at stately Wayne Manor. And he realizes, criminals are a cowardly, superstitious lot. I shall become a bat. So he doesn't become a policeman, for instance, or chief of police himself. Instead, he decides to become a costumed adventurer, the Batman. That happens right at the beginning of his career. That is a staple of all Batman origin stories. But when he is in this, what really is kind of sacred ground for Bruce Wayne, he's approached by two members of the Mutant gang. The Mutants are one of this issue's two subplots. This issue is a fairly discrete story. It's the only one, it's the only volume in these 4 issues that is a discrete comic book on its own, almost. It's a whisker away. All the others are very much, obviously, parts of a larger story. This one is a discrete story on its own. And one of the subplots is this mutant gang, which is all over Gotham. We get all sorts of reports of them doing all sorts of atrocious things. And 2 of them approach Bruce Wayne to carve him up, because, as one of them says, we have a quota to keep. But something about him, warns them off. And that incursion starts to get to Bruce Wayne. It starts to slowly in these opening pages. We are seeing the complacency of his last 10 years being chipped away. And Frank Miller makes the great dramatic decision of making one of the things that symbolizes that approaching crisis an approaching thunderstorm. Because the heat is just getting worse in Gotham City. it's breaking all kinds of records. But soon, let me skip ahead just a bit so I can show you what I mean. Soon, we're told that we're constantly breaking frame to exposition, and the exposition is beautifully done in this issue. It's talking heads, it's news programs, news bulletins, that sort of thing. And one of those news bulletins is a weatherman who is constantly updating us, first on the spiraling temperatures, and then on this oncoming storm, which is done as a kind of a photo effect on Gotham City. And he says it's headed straight for Gotham, like the wrath of God. It's headed for Gotham. And it's just a rumble. It hasn't arrived yet, because its arrival is going to coincide with this weird rebirth of Bruce Wayne, this weird rebirth of Batman. Now, while that is happening, another story is developing here involving an old Batman supervillain, Two-Face, who used to be the district attorney Harvey Dent, a good guy, a fighter for justice, but he was splashed with acid. You will have seen this in a couple of Batman movies. And one half of his face is damaged, and it destroys his mind, and he becomes a supervillain who's obsessed with duality, obsessed with the number 2, and has all sorts of... He has a coin that is scarred on one side that often dictates his actions. Two-Face has appeared in a million Batman comics, and he is going to be the villain of this story, because we see that 2 schmarmy, allegedly well-meaning but really self-seeking doctors, a psychiatrist and a plastic surgeon, have restored Harvey Dent's face. So he is no longer Two-Face anymore. They have restored his face. And Commissioner Gordon doesn't believe it. He thinks this is way too easy. This guy has committed so many crimes. But Bruce Wayne has been funding his rehabilitation and believes that this has worked. Has to believe. We see that it has to believe in this kind of redemption, that this kind of redemption is possible. And it's just kind of another really good plot twist on Frank Miller's part, that while we're watching Harvey Dent allegedly get better, get cured, we are watching Bruce Wayne descend further and further into his own psychoses, into embracing his own dual nature again after having left it aside for a long time. We see an origin sequence of a kind that changed everything for Batman. Nothing has ever gone back to being the same way again. We see Bruce Wayne as a little boy fall into what we now know as the Batcave. And in the Batcave, he scares a bunch of bats that are in the roof of the cave. But he also encounters a beast, a supernatural creature, the most ancient of warriors, that claims him for its own. And we cut forward from that scene to the present day, when the 46-year-old Bruce Wayne has gone down into the Batcave, and we see that it's all tarped over, with one exception. There's a Robin costume in a memorial glass that is not draped over. Probably a memorial to Jason Todd, probably meaning that he died in the service of fighting crime. And there is Bruce Wayne. Notice the stonework. I don't know if you can see it. It is absolutely beautifully done. Just beautifully done. And a lot of this is Klaus Janson. A lot of that shadowy artwork is Klaus Janson. And when he's down there looking at the cave for no reason, almost like he's not conscious of his own behavior, Alfred the butler shows up and says, well, the alarm, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, shouldn't you be in bed? And asks him just offhandedly, what happened to your mustache? And Bruce Wayne is surprised. Again, it's like something is taking control. It's like something is taking control, is returning him to his life's mission. Look at this beautiful artwork. Look how lovely that is. We don't see Alfred's face. We get all of these fantastic... That is Wayne Manor late at night. And Bruce Wayne is sipping the family wine, but he makes a big mistake when he's clicking through the TV channels. He makes a big mistake of alighting on The Mask of Zorro. And in this comic book, we are told that The Mask of Zorro is the movie that he and his parents were going to see when they are gunned down by a gunman in Crime Alley. That's a detail that Frank Miller has added to sort of draw a link between Batman and one of his, his pop culture predecessors. The Shadow by Lamont Cranston. Lamont Cranston, The Shadow, is not alluded to in this, but Zorro is. And naturally, this causes Bruce Wayne to flash back to that awful moment when his parents are gunned down in front of him. Only there's a difference that Frank Miller adds a little detail. The little boy is reenacting the sword fighting, and his parents are so happy behind him. But before anything horrible can happen, he sees that ancient spirit bat. He doesn't know quite what it is, but then catastrophe strikes. And then his parents are shot down in front of him. And then we get another thing that has been parodied and pastiched and knelt at the altar of for the next 40 years, which is the pearls. Martha Wayne's pearls that just become this talisman. The whole story's written about them. And the guy who sold them to her, and her decision to put them on that night. Utterly ridiculous, but we'll get to that. We'll get to the tyranny of imaginary stories in just a bit. The artwork here is incredible because that is what does it. Remembering his origin is what does it. Look at that panel. Look at that. Look at the comparison there. Look at that. That ends it. That destroys it. That destroys the small amount of control that he had over whatever made him Batman originally. We're told, the time has come. You know it in your soul. For I am your soul. You cannot escape me. You are puny. You are small. You are nothing. A hollow shell. A rusty trap that cannot hold me. Smoldering, I burn you. Burning you, I flare. Hot and bright and fierce and beautiful. You cannot stop me. Not with wine or vows or the weight of age. You cannot stop me, but still you try. Still you run. Like I mentioned, Frank Miller he's not only ripping off a whole bunch of writers, he's ripping off a whole bunch of really melodramatic purple prose writers. But that's okay, because once he's clean, once he showers, he seems to have a bit of control back. He goes to his answering machine. Those of you who are very young, from the 20th century, the 21st century, will need to Google that. He goes to his answering machine, and we get a few more Easter eggs. He has a message from someone named Clark, telling him that I'll be out of town, way out of town. He gets a message from someone named Selina, obviously Selina Kyle, Catwoman. And while he's in his office getting those messages, it all happens again. A bat crashing through the windows. Only not a little bat this time. It's obviously that same spirit bat that he encountered once before. And we don't see that it's happening. In reality, it's obviously partly this is a metaphor of what's happening in his brain. But that coincides with the rumble of thunder, because that brings back this character. He saves a woman from being mugged, and instead of a rumble, we have lightning. He saves. He exacts vengeance on a cruel pimp who is attacking one of his prostitutes, and we get more lightning. See how Miller is amping up the visuals there. And then he saves two little girls from the mutant gang, and reports are starting to flood into the news programs about how someone's beating up the criminals of Gotham City, and the impression that this someone is leaving certainly seems a lot like Batman. Could it be that Batman has returned? And the same time that people are wondering whether or not Batman has returned, two cars are robbing a place, and the minute you see the theme 2, you know that Jim Gordon was right, that Harvey Dent is not cured. Two-Face is back and committing crimes. These things are happening right at the same time, and we've gotten these increasingly bright blasts of thunder. And notice the panels are all small except for that one. That is big, and that's because Frank Miller is very good at using the size of panels to make dramatic points. And boy, oh boy, does he do that in the next panel. Because this robbery, there are two cops on the scene. They are chasing. And then they slow down. The rookie cop says, "You're slowing down. Why?" And the older cop says, "We're in for a show." And then we get the first big splash panel of the show. Boom. It's Batman. with Gotham City in the background, tilted at an angle. And he is saying that I should be in agony. But I'm not, because I'm a man of 30 again, of 20. I'm born again. He attacks these criminals, disables one of them, and defeats the others, and learns from them that Two-Face is back. There is a coin that is scratched. He knows that his old enemy is back. And the older cop is happy to see him back. He tells the older cop, "Tell Gordon we need to talk." Which means fire up the bat signal again. A thing as you've seen, again, if you've watched the movies or read any of the comics, then you know it's been used endlessly. But by this point, everything is in motion. Two-Face is back on a crime spree in Gotham City. The heat wave has broken. Batman has returned. There's only one element, one elemental piece of the Batman mythos that any fan reading this is going to be wondering about. And that is the Joker. Batman's ultimate villain is not Two-Face. Two-Face is a little too close to the bone. They are a little too similar for them to be ultimate villain status. No, it's the Joker. And we see the Joker. He's in Arkham Asylum. And when he starts to notice on the news reports that Batman has returned, he starts to smile. That stereotypical maniac smile of the Joker. And when I read this back in '86, I thought, okay, that is really well done. You know perfectly well, you, Frank Miller, know perfectly well that Batman fans only want to see one villain in this thing. But you're not serving him up right away. You're teasing him. That's very, very good. But I also thought something negative when I saw this portrayal, because what does the Joker say? Batman, darling. Because in Frank Miller's world, gay means perverted and evil. Gay means you're a bad guy, and it was a very obvious step. In retrospect, it's been done a million times in comics since then, but at the moment that I read that, I thought, okay, no writer has ever actually crossed that obvious line and said outright that the Joker's fascination with Batman, and maybe Batman's fascination with the Joker, has a sexual element to it. It may have been, I may be filling in these memories fraudulently, but I think it may have been that moment, that exact moment, Batman, darling. It may have been that exact moment when reading that original issue from the newsstand, I thought, for the first time, a little skittering thought of, God help me if this guy writes Superman. God help me if he brings Superman into this story. Of course, at the time, I had no idea. We will be getting to Superman. Don't you worry. but in the meantime, there's a raucous debate about whether or not Batman is a good thing, whether or not it's good that he's back in the world. Jim Gordon has no doubt about that. He sets the bat signal up and calls Batman to him to discuss whoever this is. Gordon believes it's Two-Face, who's back, running wild. And Batman, Bruce Wayne, wants to believe it's not. Wants to believe it's a copycat. Wants to believe that Harvey Dent was rehabilitated. Look at this panel. There they are. There are our two heroes. Barely shadows. Look at that. How beautiful that is. That is just gorgeous. Say what you want about Miller, and I have said plenty, but as a visual artist, oh my. Oh my. And then we get the plot where Two-Face attacks. He uses two helicopters to attack two different locations. Batman, it's a fairly standard thing. Batman has to figure out what's going on, use Daring Do to stop him. We get all of these crowded panels here where there's news reports and Batman taking action against the villains. He fires a harpoon to attach to one of the helicopters. And Miller obviously wants you to breathe a little. He sees you, all these crammed panels, but he wants you to remember the heroism of this. And so when Batman is shot, and he seems to be falling, he says in this exchange of panels, why do you think I put a target on my chest? It's to draw fire there. It's because I can't armor my head. I can put armor plating on my chest. Again, that kind of thinking, no one had ever thought that before. No, that was just wonderful. That was just a revelation to read. It seems pretty simple now, but when you can have, for instance, Ben Affleck's Batman, somebody in an action sequence, somebody can fire point blank right at the back of his cowl, and we just assume it's bulletproof. No physics works that way. One of those shots would certainly incapacitate a normal human being. Even if it didn't penetrate the cowl could not absorb the kinetic energy. The person would still be concussed for a year. Much less multiple shots like that. But we're supposed to assume that from that movie. But in this comic, it was the first single that Batman would be bulletproof at all, that he would wear plating even on his chest. He says that he's falling, but that he has to know whether or not it's Harvey. So he pulls up on the harpoon that he has attached to the helicopter, and we get one of those huge panel breathing points. Because there he is, snapping to the end of that wire, and look at, again, the city is tilted at an angle, snapping at the end of that wire to sort of swing around. And crash through the windows. Again, we get Frank Miller's writing. We tumble like lovers. The air is cold. The night is silent. You have to take up the good and the bad there. And that's how this issue ends. Batman finds out that it is Harvey Dent, and that Harvey Dent thinks that he has been totally disfigured. In his own mind, that's where his injuries have always been. It doesn't matter what the plastic surgery has done. And Batman says, I see a kindred soul. I see a reflection. Because he thinks about his own duality. He thinks about that giant spirit bat that made him Batman. And that's how this story ends, this first issue. You notice that it's a little bit tentative. You don't associate that with one of the most important, most influential comic sequences in all of superhero comics. I don't think that's any exaggeration to say. You don't associate hesitation with that or timidity at all. But this first issue has a discrete plot and a kind of neat little bow on the end where I see a reflection. The duality that's been running throughout this issue all along of Harvey Dent and Bruce Wayne is sort of wrapped up kind of neatly at the end. We assume that Harvey Dent will go back to Arkham Asylum. We assume that the doctors who said he was rehabilitated are totally discredited and won't try it again. We assume Harvey Dent will never get out again, that he'll never get loose again, and that Batman is now back. It is almost possible to just wrap a bow on this thing and say that it's a complete standalone story, except for two things. The mutants, who have called for the death of Jim Gordon, they've called for the death of Batman, and also the Joker. The Joker is Chekhov's gun. You don't introduce him if you're not going to use him. And so we know from that more is coming. And that this isn't going to be just 4 standalone issues. When I first started reading this back in 1986, I thought, there's going to be 4 standalone stories about this future Batman. That's kind of interesting. Maybe he dies at the end or whatever. But it is in fact one big story. It's that one big story is at its weakest in this first volume. It's still very effective. This first volume is still very effective. But that bigger story unfolds in the rest of the 3. I was telling Matthew, this is the only one that won't feel like it has momentum for you. All the others will. Because the next 3 installments in this read-along are really one big story. But that's how we start out with Batman Dark Knight Returns. Hard to overestimate the seismic impact this thing had on the industry. It made comics grittier. It made comics joyless. It made comics far more explicitly sadomasochistic and sordid. Violence of an astonishingly creepy nature starts to creep in to mainstream comics. The Elseworlds books were a little bit age appropriate, but after this, it started creeping in everywhere. But for now, I will wrap up with a sort of thumbnail of the effect that this thing's had on the industry at the end of the month. But for now, we're going to move on to the next volume. Do I have it right here? I didn't prepare my props ahead of time. Yes, yeah, okay. I'm going to be reading this week. We move on next time to volume 2. Ooh, Bats has seen better days. But we move on to volume 2. That was the original cover for this thing, just Batman crammed in between the dimensions of the cover and not looking very good. We move on to volume 2 next week. So if you are reading along, feel free to send up a flare and let me know. And if you're reading along and you have a BookTube channel, tell me, make a video and tell me what your thoughts were. I would love to know. I mean, I'm happy, privileged to get your emails. I love them, but a video would be a lot of fun too. Anyway, just a suggestion. One way or another, Matthew and I are going to barrel along to part 2. What is part 2 called? I think it's called Dark Knight Triumphant. Is that what part 2 is called? Oh, maybe it doesn't tell me. Oh no, it just jumps. Oh yes, yeah. Dark Knight Triumphant is part number 2. Part 2 of Dark Knight Returns. So I will be back next weekend to talk about that. Who knows what effect it will have on Matthew. He seemed to enjoy this first issue. I could tell because in his reaction video, I'll leave a link to it down below, he mostly just excitedly narrates it, and that is always a sure sign that you have really enjoyed what you've read, that you just want to tell people what happens. I have a feeling that the next 3 issues are going to just plain blow him away. And you too, if you're reading it for the first time. But who knows? Who knows what my reactions will be when I read this second issue slowly and in isolation from the rest of the book. This box set makes it's perfect for that. So anyway, I'm gonna wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.